a billionaire heiress, a broken car that no expert could fix for 7 years, and a small-town mechanic she laughed at the moment he walked through her gate. She thought she was hiring someone to fix an engine. She had no idea he was about to crack open a secret her family had buried with her father. What he found inside that car didn't just start an engine. It set off a chain reaction that would tear apart a dynasty, heal a family, and change 2 broken people forever. Don't go anywhere. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The call came on a Tuesday morning, which was already a bad sign. Ethan Walker didn't trust Tuesdays. Nothing good had ever started on a Tuesday. Not his marriage, not the custody hearing, not the morning 3 years ago when his son had looked him in the eye at breakfast and said, quietly and without anger, "Dad, you're never actually here even when you're sitting right in front of me." That had been a Tuesday too. So when his cell phone buzzed at 7:14 in the morning and he saw a number he didn't recognize with a Georgia area code, Ethan almost let it go to voicemail. He was elbow deep in the carburetor of a 1971 Chevelle, and his coffee was still hot, and those 2 things together were about as close to peace as he usually got before 9 a.m. He picked up anyway. "Is this Ethan Walker?" The voice on the other end was female, clipped, with the specific kind of efficiency that told him this woman got paid to talk to people she considered beneath her time. "Depends on who's asking." A pause. Not long, just long enough to communicate that she found the response mildly irritating. "My name is Renata Cole. I'm the personal estate manager for Victoria Ashford. Miss Ashford is looking for a mechanic who specializes in vintage British automobiles. You were recommended." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the Chevelle's quarter panel. "By who?" "A Mr. Gerald Fitch, formerly of Savannah Restorations." Gerald Fitch. Ethan hadn't spoken to Gerald in almost 2 years, not since the older man had retired and sold his shop. Gerald was the kind of mechanic who'd been doing it for 50 years and still got down on the floor to look underneath things himself. If Gerald had given his name to someone, it meant something. "What's the car?" Ethan asked. "A 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. It belonged to Ms. Ashford's late father. It has not run in approximately 7 years. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He set his coffee down on the workbench. 7 years, he said. "Yes. And in 7 years, nobody's been able to get it running." "Correct. How many people have looked at it?" Another pause. 14 mechanics and restoration specialists, including 2 certified Rolls-Royce technicians from the UK. Ethan picked up his coffee again. He took a slow sip. Outside his garage, a mockingbird was going through its whole repertoire in the oak tree by the fence. Cardinal call, blue jay call, something that sounded almost like a car alarm. "Where's the estate?" he finally asked. 12 miles outside of Macon. Ms. Ashford would like you there by Friday." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really a request. Ethan noticed that. "I'll need to look at my schedule." "Mr. Walker," Renata Cole's voice didn't rise. It just got very precise. "Ms. Ashford is prepared to pay your full day rate plus travel costs, plus a completion bonus that I think you'll find significant. Shall I send the figure to this number?" The number came through 40 seconds later. Ethan stared at it for a while. Then he looked around his garage. The good garage, the one he'd built from nothing over 11 years. The one that paid its bills, but not much more than that. The one that still had a water stain on the ceiling from the leak he hadn't been able to afford to fix last winter. "Tell Ms. Ashford I'll be there Friday morning," he said. He didn't tell his son about it right away. Marcus was 15, lived with his mother during the week, and spent every other weekend with Ethan in the small house behind the garage. Those weekends were, Ethan was honest enough with himself to admit this, never quite what he imagined they'd be during the weeks in between. In his head, the weekends were easy and warm. In reality, there was usually at least one long silence that neither of them knew how to fill. At least one moment where Ethan said the wrong thing without knowing why it was wrong. At least one evening where Marcus sat on the couch with his headphones in and Ethan sat in the kitchen pretending to read. He loved his son with an intensity that sometimes frightened him. He just didn't always know what to do with that love once Marcus was actually in the room. On Thursday evening, when Marcus was packing his bag to go back to his mother's, Ethan mentioned the job. "Some estate out near Macon," he said. leaning in the doorway of the small bedroom that was technically Marcus's, but had the feeling of a guest room. Old Rolls-Royce. Should be interesting. Marcus looked up briefly from his bag. He had his mother's eyes, large and quick, taking everything in without necessarily letting you know what they'd registered. Cool, he said. Might be gone for a few weeks if it's complicated. Okay. Ethan waited in case there was more. There wasn't. You need a ride to your mom's? He asked. She's picking me up. He nodded. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than he should have. Okay, he said, and went back to the kitchen. He drove to Macon on Friday morning with the windows down because the truck's air conditioning had been broken for 3 months, and he'd been putting off fixing it the same way he put off a lot of things that required sitting still and dealing with them directly. The drive took him through the kind of Georgia landscape that looked different depending on what you'd had for breakfast and what was weighing on you. Red clay banks and kudzu-draped tree lines and the occasional rusted farm structure sitting at an angle in a field like it had been tired for decades. Ethan had grown up 2 counties over from here. He knew this land the way you know a face you've looked at your whole life without ever quite studying it. He almost missed the turn for the Ashford estate. The entrance wasn't marked with anything grand, just a pair of stone pillars half hidden by magnolias and a wrought iron gate that opened slowly and without theatrics as his truck approached. There must have been a camera somewhere. He hadn't seen one. The driveway was long and curved through old hardwood trees, and when the house appeared, it appeared the way large old houses always did, gradually and then all at once. It was antebellum in structure, white-columned and wide, the kind of house that had its own gravitational field. Not beautiful exactly, more like permanent, like it had always been here and had simply permitted the rest of the world to grow up around it. He pulled his truck around to where a man in his 50s was waiting near a side garage, not the decorative carriage house kind, but a proper functional garage, long and climate-controlled. The man introduced himself as Thomas, the property's caretaker, and shook Ethan's hand with the kind of grip that told you he'd been working with his hands his whole life. Ms. Ashford asked me to get you settled in before she comes down, Thomas said, which told Ethan that Victoria Ashford was not the kind of woman who waited at the door. The Rolls-Royce was inside the garage, at the far end, under a fitted cover. Even covered, it had presence. Ethan could see the shape of it, the long hood, the particular angle of the windshield, the way the chrome bumper caught what little light filtered through the high windows. How long has it been sitting exactly? Ethan asked. 7 years and 3 months, Thomas said, without having to think about it. Since the day Mr. Ashford passed. Has anyone driven it since? No, sir. The last time that engine ran was the morning he died. He'd taken it out early morning, before anyone was up, came back, parked it, went inside. Thomas looked at the covered car in a way that was difficult to read. That was the last time. Ethan nodded slowly. He walked around the car without touching it yet, just looking at the outline of it under the cover. Who were the other mechanics? The ones who couldn't fix it? Different folks over the years. 2 of them were brought over from England, certified Rolls specialists. Thomas folded his arms across his chest. Every one of them said the same thing, which was that there was nothing wrong with it. Ethan looked up. Mechanically, they all said it appeared to be in perfect condition, just wouldn't start. Thomas paused. Ms. Ashford eventually stopped bringing people in. She said she'd rather leave it than let more strangers poke at it. What changed her mind? Thomas seemed to consider whether to answer that. She's been thinking about selling the estate, he said finally. The car goes with the property unless she decides otherwise. She wanted it running before she made any decisions. Before Ethan could respond, he heard footsteps on the concrete behind him. He turned around. Bassett. The first thing he noticed about Victoria Ashford was not that she was beautiful, though she was, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being looked at. The first thing he noticed was that she was already looking at him the way people look at something they're not sure is worth their time. She was dressed casually by estate standards, dark slacks, a silk blouse the color of a winter sky. But there was nothing casual about the way she carried herself. She stopped about 10 feet from him and looked him over once, briefly but completely. "You're the mechanic," she said. "Not you must be Ethan Walker. Just, "You're the mechanic." "Ethan Walker," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. Her grip was brief and dry and said absolutely nothing. "Gerald Fitch speaks highly of you," she said. "Gerald's a good judge. He said you have a gift for finding problems other people miss." She looked past him at the covered car. "I hope that's true, and not just Gerald being sentimental. He has a weakness for underdogs." Ethan kept his face neutral. He was good at that. Years of practice, years of clients who thought the price of what they owned entitled them to look at the people fixing it a certain way. "Tell me about the car," he said. She did, briefly. Her father, William Ashford, had purchased the Silver Shadow in 1987, when it was already 22 years old and had been in the possession of a British diplomat. He had restored it himself over 3 years, not professionally, but obsessively, the way men of his generation sometimes fixated on mechanical things when everything else in their lives was happening too fast. It had been his most prized possession and his private retreat. He drove it every Sunday morning without fail, early, before the house woke up. "The morning he died," Victoria said, and her voice didn't change, not in any way that was visible. "He'd taken it out as usual. Came back around 7. I was having coffee in the kitchen. He walked past, didn't say anything. I thought he was tired." She paused. "He went upstairs. 2 hours later we found him." "Heart attack?" Ethan asked. He didn't soften the question. He'd found that people who'd been living with loss for years usually preferred direct questions to careful ones. "Yes." "And no one's been able to start the car since that morning." "No one." Ethan looked at the rolls again. "May I take the cover off?" "That's what you're here for." He lifted the cover slowly, folding it back in sections, and what emerged was extraordinary. Even after 7 years of sitting, the Silver Shadow was immaculate, long and low and painted in a deep silver blue that seemed to hold light inside it rather than simply reflecting it. The chrome was perfect. The leather interior, visible through the windows, was uncracked and rich. It was not the car of a man who had loved it casually. "He kept it in condition," Ethan said. He had Thomas do the exterior maintenance, but he wouldn't let anyone touch the mechanical side except himself. She was watching him now with something that might have been curiosity, though it hadn't quite decided to become that yet. "He said the engine was the car's soul, and you don't let strangers touch someone's soul." Ethan crouched down and looked along the undercarriage. "Smart man," he said. Something flickered across Victoria's face, there and gone before he could read it. "I'll need a few days just to assess," he said, standing. "I won't promise what the others couldn't deliver, but I'll tell you what I find." "That's all I'm asking," she said. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, and Ethan had the clear impression that the conversation had ended at exactly the moment she decided it had. Thomas had set up a small room above the carriage house where Ethan could stay during the week, returning home on weekends. It was simple and clean: a bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over the south lawn toward a pond ringed with cypress trees. Ethan had stayed in worse places for worse jobs. That evening, after he'd made his initial notes on the car and eaten the dinner Thomas had quietly left outside his door, chicken, rice, green beans, the food of a practical man, he sat at the window and called Marcus. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He sat there a while longer, watching the last of the light leave the pond. He spent the first 3 days doing nothing but looking. That was his method, the one that had made his reputation among people who understood what reputation meant in a field like his. Other mechanics came in with diagnostic tools and lifted hoods and began testing components. Ethan came in and looked at the whole thing first. The position of the car, the dust patterns, the way light moved through the windows across the engine bay at different times of day, the small details that told a story about how something had been used and what had happened to it. He didn't start the car, didn't even try. He just observed. On the 4th morning, he opened the hood. The engine bay was extraordinary. Not just clean, arranged. Every component in its precise location, every wire perfectly routed, every surface without a trace of the oil leaks and grime that accumulated in even well-maintained engines over decades. It was the engine bay of a man who had treated the mechanical with the same reverence others reserved for art. Ethan ran his fingers along the valve cover. He checked the distributor cap, the plug wires, the fuel lines. He pulled the spark plugs and examined each one under a work light. He checked compression. Everything was perfect. He stood back and folded his arms across his chest and thought about that. 14 mechanics, 2 certified Rolls-Royce specialists from England. All of them had said the same thing. Mechanically, the car was sound. There was no reason it shouldn't run, which meant either every single one of those mechanics had missed something, possible but improbable, or there was something here that nobody had been looking for. He began again, more slowly this time. Well, he'd been on the estate for 8 days when he had his first real conversation with Victoria Ashford. He'd been aware of her presence the way you're aware of weather, not constantly, but as a background condition that affected the atmosphere. She appeared at the garage occasionally, stood in the doorway, and watched for a few minutes without speaking, then left. She didn't hover. She didn't ask questions. He appreciated that, in a grudging way. On the 8th evening, he was sitting in the garage with the work lights on, going through his notes, when she appeared again. This time, she came all the way in, which was different. She was holding a glass of wine. 1 glass, not 2. And she looked at his spread of notes and diagrams for a moment before speaking. "You're still assessing," she said. "Still looking." The others started running tests immediately. "I know, I can see what they tested. The documentation from the previous mechanics is thorough." He gestured at the stack of folders Thomas had provided. "They were all good at what they did. They tested everything that should have been tested." "But?" Ethan looked up at her. "They tested everything that should have been wrong. I'm trying to figure out what shouldn't have been touched, but was." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the Rolls-Royce, and whatever was in her expression when she looked at it, it wasn't what people usually looked like when they looked at an old car, even a beautiful one. "You look at it like it still belongs to him," Ethan said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. She looked back at him. Something in her eyes was careful and compressed, like a room where all the windows had been shut against weather. "It does," she said. "I'm sorry about your father." She nodded once, the nod of someone who has received condolences many times and has learned to receive them without being moved by them. He'd be furious, you know, that the car doesn't run. He was not a man who accepted things being broken. What was he like? The question surprised her. He could see it. A small recalibration. People working on her property did not usually ask her about her father. "Complicated," she said, after a pause. "Most people worth remembering are." She looked at him for a moment with something that was almost, but not quite, a different opinion of him. Then she turned and walked out of the garage with her wine glass, and the night swallowed her back up. What? He found it on the 11th day. He'd been working his way back through the ignition system for the 3rd time. Not because he expected to find something new, but because the discipline of doing something again from the beginning sometimes revealed what rushing had obscured. He was tracing the wiring harness with patient, methodical care, following each wire from its terminal through its routing path. When he felt it. Not saw. Felt. A section of the wiring loom that ran behind the dashboard had a texture that was slightly different from the rest. Not damaged, not deteriorated, just different. Like something had been worked on there, carefully, and then covered over. He got a flashlight and looked. What he found, once he understood what he was looking at, stopped him completely. He sat back on his heels and stayed very still for almost a minute. Someone had modified the ignition system with extraordinary precision. The modification was invisible to a normal inspection. It required knowing exactly what you were looking for and exactly where to look. It would have passed diagnostic testing because it was designed to pass diagnostic testing. But at a specific point in the ignition sequence, the modification would interrupt the circuit in a way that was so brief and so perfectly timed that the engine simply would not start. The car had not broken down. The car had been stopped, not by time or mechanical failure or 7 years of sitting, by a person who knew exactly what they were doing, by a person who had access to the car, by a person who had a reason. He sat in the garage with the work lights humming above him, and he thought about an old man who drove his beloved car every Sunday morning, early, alone, and came back one last morning and went upstairs and never came back down. And he thought, someone did this before he died, or after, and then, or he did it himself. Quote, he didn't say anything to Victoria that day. He needed to think. He called his friend and former mentor, Ray Kowalski, who was 71 and had spent 40 years working on everything from pre-war Packards to modern supercars, and who was the only person Ethan trusted completely when he was in over his head. Walk me through it again, Ray said, after Ethan explained what he'd found. Ethan did. So it's deliberate, Ray said. Has to be. The precision involved. This wasn't an amateur. Whoever did this understood Rolls-Royce ignition systems at a level beyond most specialists. The car's owner, Ray said. That's what I keep coming back to. Ray was quiet for a moment. Did he have the mechanical knowledge? According to his daughter, he restored the car himself over 3 years. And the engine bay is... Ray, this car is a work of art. He knew what he was doing. So a man decides to disable his own car, Ray said slowly, deliberately, precisely, in a way that would survive any inspection. Yes. And then dies. Yes. And leaves the car disabled. Ethan looked out the window of the carriage house at the dark lawn. There's something else, he said. When I was working behind the dashboard, I found something in the wiring area, something that doesn't belong. What kind of something? I haven't pulled it out yet. I wanted to talk to you first, but Ray, it looks like there's a sealed envelope back there, fitted into a space that was clearly prepared for it. The silence on the phone was long enough that Ethan checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Son, Ray finally said, that is not a mechanical problem anymore. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. He pulled the envelope out the next morning carefully and alone before Thomas arrived. It was yellowed with age and sealed with wax, actual wax, pressed with what appeared to be a signet ring, on the front in handwriting that was precise and slightly old-fashioned. For Victoria. Ethan held it for a long time. The envelope was sealed. Whatever was inside, he had not read it and would not read it. That much was simple. That was the only part that was simple. He thought about what finding this meant. He thought about who had put it there and why. He thought about a man who had gotten up early on his last morning, driven this car one final time, come home, and walked past his daughter in the kitchen without speaking. I thought he was tired, she had said. What does a man do on his last morning? Does he know it's his last morning? A heart attack can come without warning. But sometimes the body knows before the mind does. Sometimes a person knows. Had William Ashford driven his car one last time knowing, or just feeling, that the end was close? Had he hidden this letter years ago, or weeks ago, or on that last morning? Had he driven past the kitchen and not spoken to his daughter because he was tired or because he couldn't? Ethan didn't know. He might never know. But he knew what he had to do with what he'd found. He set the envelope on his workbench and carefully, with clean hands, wrapped it in a clean cloth. Then he went to find Victoria Ashford. He found her in the garden, which he hadn't known existed until Thomas directed him through a gate in the east wall of the property. It was a working garden, not decorative, but a real one, with raised beds and heirloom tomato plants and herbs, and a riot of unplanned color at the edges where wildflowers had been allowed to take over. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected topiary, formal arrangements, things that performed rather than grew. She was kneeling next to a raised bed, doing something precise with her hands. She didn't look up when he came through the gate, though she must have heard him. What is it? She said. He'd thought about how to do this during the walk from the garage, and he still hadn't figured out the right way. There probably wasn't a right way. I need you to come to the garage, he said. She looked up then, read his face, stood, brushing soil from her knees. You found something, she said. Yes. She waited for him to tell her what. I'd rather show you, he said. She studied him for a moment in that careful, compressed way she had. Then she walked past him toward the gate. But in the garage under the work lights, Ethan told her everything. He explained what he'd found in the ignition system as plainly as he could. The modification, its nature, its precision, the conclusion it led to. He watched her face as he talked. She was very still. She was the kind of person who went still when the ground moved under her rather than grabbing for something. When he finished, she said nothing for a long moment. He disabled it himself, she said. It wasn't a question. That's my conclusion. I can't be completely certain, but the level of knowledge required and the access necessary, yes, I believe so. Why? I don't know. He paused. But I think you might. She looked at him sharply. He reached for the wrapped cloth on the workbench and set it in front of her. I found this, he said, in a compartment behind the dashboard, a space that was prepared specifically to hold it. He carefully unwrapped the cloth. It's sealed. I haven't opened it. I won't. Victoria Ashford looked at the envelope on the workbench. She looked at her own name in her father's handwriting. Something happened in her face that was private and large and completely unguarded. The first completely unguarded thing Ethan had seen in her. And then she reached out and picked it up. Her hands were shaking. Not much, but enough. She stood there in the fluorescent light of the garage, holding her dead father's last letter, and she looked at Ethan Walker, the mechanic she'd dismissed before he'd said a word, the man she'd expected nothing from, the man who had found what no one else had found. And for the first time since he'd arrived on her estate, she looked at him without any armor at all. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. Ethan nodded. "Take your time," he said. He picked up his tools and moved to the other side of the garage and began working on something that didn't need working on, giving her the only privacy he could. He heard her tear the seal. He heard the dry sound of paper unfolding. And then, after a long silence, he heard something he hadn't expected to hear, hadn't been prepared for, didn't know what to do with. He heard Victoria Ashford begin to cry. Not loud, not dramatically. Just the quiet, helpless sound of someone being broken open by something they had waited too long for and waited too long without. Ethan kept his back turned and kept his hands moving and said nothing. Some things you can't fix with tools. Some things need to be let through before they can be carried. He worked until the sound stopped, until the garage was quiet again except for the hum of the lights and the mockingbird starting up again somewhere in the oaks outside. Then he set down his wrench and waited. She didn't come back to the garage that day. Ethan didn't expect her to. He packed up his tools at 6:30, turned off the work lights, and walked back to the carriage house through the long Georgia evening, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and the distant sweetness of something blooming in the south garden. He didn't know what. He'd never been good at identifying flowers. His ex-wife Dana used to point them out on walks, and he'd nod and forget the names immediately, and she'd eventually stopped pointing. He heated up a can of soup on the small two-burner stove in the carriage house kitchen, ate it standing over the sink, and tried to read the paperback he'd brought. He read the same page 4 times without retaining any of it. What he kept coming back to was not Victoria's face when she'd looked at the envelope, though that image was lodged somewhere behind his sternum in a way he hadn't anticipated. What he kept coming back to was the sound of her crying in that garage, the specific quality of it, the way it had been contained and private, even while he was standing 30 feet away. The way it had sounded like something that had been held under pressure for a very long time and had finally found the one crack it could get through. He'd heard grief before, had his own, but there was a specific sound to grief that has been kept too tightly controlled for too many years, and Victoria Ashford made that sound, and something about it had gotten into him in a way he hadn't been prepared for. He set down his book. He called Marcus. This time, it rang twice before his son picked up. "Hey." Marcus sounded guarded, the way he usually did when his father called unexpectedly, like he was bracing for something he couldn't quite identify. "Hey, just calling to check in." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed. "How's school?" "Fine." "You have that history thing this week? The presentation?" A pause. Not long, but he could feel Marcus recalibrating, adjusting to the fact that his father had actually remembered. "Yeah, Thursday." "How are you feeling about it?" "I don't know." "Okay, I think." Another pause. "It's about the New Deal. Mr. Patterson likes it when you argue against the consensus, so I'm going to say it had more limitations than people admit." Ethan smiled, and it surprised him. The smile came before he'd decided to. "That's smart. Teachers remember the ones who push back." "That's what I thought." They talked for another few minutes, careful, a little stilted, like two people crossing ice and testing each footstep before committing to it, but talking. When Marcus finally said he had homework, Ethan said goodnight and stayed sitting on the edge of the bed after he hung up, looking at the dark square of window and thinking about a sealed letter and a man who had waited too long to say the things that mattered. Victoria didn't appear at the garage the next morning or the morning after that. Ethan worked. He documented the ignition modification in full, photographs, detailed notes, measurements, and then began the careful process of understanding exactly how it had been constructed. The elegance of it continued to unsettle him in a professional sense. This wasn't a crude bypass or a simple disconnected wire. It was a system, layered, precise, and self-concealing. Whoever built it had anticipated that mechanics would look at this car and had designed the modification to survive scrutiny. The more he studied it, the more certain he became that it was William Ashford's work. The precision matched the engine bay, the same philosophy, the same standard. A man who cared this much about the mechanical wouldn't tolerate sloppiness in his own modifications. And there was something else. The modification showed intimate knowledge of this specific car, its quirks, its individual tolerances. This wasn't knowledge you got from a service manual. This was knowledge you built over years of working with one particular machine. Thomas brought lunch to the garage around noon both days, knocked on the frame, and left the tray without coming in. On the second day, Ethan called him back. "Thomas, sit down a minute." The older man hesitated. He wasn't the kind to sit in the middle of a workday, but he came in and leaned against the workbench, which was his version of sitting. "How long did you work for William Ashford?" Ethan asked. 31 years. "So you knew him?" "I suppose I did, yes." "Did he ever talk to you about the car? When it started having problems after he died? What did you make of it?" Thomas looked at the rolls for a moment, his expression neutral in the specific way of someone who has learned to keep their feelings out of their face around people who employ them. "I thought it was grief," he said. "The car knew its owner was gone. That's a foolish thought, I know. It's not foolish. But that's not what it was." "No," Ethan said. "It wasn't." Thomas nodded slowly. He'd seen Ethan working behind the dashboard. He wasn't a foolish man. He'd drawn some conclusions, or at least some suspicions. "Did you tell her?" he asked. "Yes. 2 days ago." "And the letter?" Ethan looked at him. Thomas met his look steadily. "I saw it," Thomas said simply. "When you found it, I was in the doorway. You didn't see me." He paused. "I didn't come in. It wasn't my business." "Does it surprise you?" Ethan asked carefully, "that he hid something in the car?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Ethan let it sit. He was a man who found it easier to put things down than to hand them to people, Thomas said finally. He could build things and fix things and restore things. He was not good at giving what he had to people who needed it. Another pause. "I don't think he was bad. I think he just ran out of time before he figured out how." Ethan thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. On the third morning after the letter, he was checking the fuel delivery system when he heard her voice behind him. "I owe you an apology." He turned around. Victoria Ashford was standing in the garage doorway, and she looked different, not softer exactly. That wasn't the right word. More present. Like she'd been somewhere else for the past 3 days and had come back to her own face. She was wearing a simple linen shirt and jeans, which he hadn't seen on her before. She looked younger, also more tired. "For what?" he said. "For how I spoke to you when you arrived." She came a few steps into the garage. Her hands were in her pockets. Another thing he hadn't seen from her. "I was condescending. I'd decided what you were before you said a word." Ethan regarded her for a moment. He'd had this apology coming, and he'd have been lying if he said he hadn't wanted it. But now that it was here, he found he wasn't interested in making her earn it. "You've had a lot of people come through here who couldn't do what they said they could," he said. "That adds up." "That's a generous interpretation." "It's a practical one." She looked at him with those careful, newly opened eyes. "You're not going to let me properly apologize, are you?" "You apologized. I heard it. We're fine." He turned back to the fuel lines. "Pull up that stool if you want to stay." She did. She pulled up the shop stool and sat on it and watched him work, and neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was different from the silences that had existed between them before. less like a wall, more like a room they were both in. "I've been thinking about what you found," she said eventually. "The modification or the letter?" "Both, but the modification mostly." She was watching his hands move among the machinery. "If he built it, and I believe you that he did, then he planned it. It wasn't a decision made in grief or panic. It took time and skill." "Yes." "He didn't want the car to run after he was gone." Ethan set down his tool and turned to face her properly. "That's what it looks like." "Why?" She asked it the same way she had before, and he gave her the same honest answer. "I don't know. I can tell you what the machine tells me. The rest is yours to figure out." She looked at the Rolls-Royce. "The letter helps," she said quietly. "Some of it, other parts of it, make less sense, or make too much sense in ways I'm still working through." He didn't push. He picked his tool back up. "He wasn't a man who said things directly," she said. "He operated through objects, through gestures. He'd fix something in your room without telling you he'd noticed it was broken. He'd leave a book on your desk without saying why." She paused. "I always thought he just wasn't interested in words, in the actual saying of things. But the letter." She stopped. She pressed her lips together once. "He knew how to say things. He left it too late. He wrote things to me that I needed 20 years ago and put them in a car and locked them there and went upstairs and—" She stopped again. The mockingbird was at it again somewhere outside. The one that went through all its voices, one after another. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. He meant it differently than the first time he'd said it to her. Less formally, more simply, the way you say it when you're saying it to another person rather than to a stranger you feel you should acknowledge. She nodded. Not the condolences received nod from before. A real one. "What does the letter tell you about the car?" he asked, after a moment. "Why he stopped it from running." She thought about it. "He loved that car more than almost anything," she said slowly. I think he didn't want anyone else to have it, not in the sense of keeping it from them. More, he didn't want it to be someone else's. He wanted it to stay his." She paused. "But he also left me the letter inside it, which means he wanted me to come looking, eventually." Ethan sat with that for a moment. "He wanted you to find it yourself," he said. "He wanted the right person to find it," she corrected quietly. "He must have known experts would look at it. He trusted that they'd all say the same thing, that there was nothing mechanically wrong, and he trusted that eventually someone would come who looked at it differently. Or," Ethan said, "he just trusted that you'd eventually find someone stubborn enough not to take that for an answer." Something crossed her face that was almost a smile. Not quite, but the shape of one. The phone call from Dana came on a Friday afternoon, which was also not good. Ethan was at the grocery store in town, a small town called Carver, 12 miles from the estate, which had a hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, and the kind of grocery store where everyone looked up when someone new came in. He'd driven in for supplies and was standing in the cereal aisle when Dana's name appeared on his phone. He and Dana had been divorced for 6 years. They had arrived at a functional civility that worked as long as neither of them pushed on anything. Dana had remarried 2 years ago, a man named Jeff, who did something in commercial real estate and appeared to be steady and kind and present in ways that Ethan, apparently, had not been. "He didn't do the presentation," Dana said, without preamble. "He stayed home sick, only he wasn't sick." Ethan put the cereal box back. "What?" "I talked to Mr. Patterson today. Marcus never came in on Thursday. He told me he went to school." Ethan walked out of the aisle, away from the other shoppers. "Where was he?" "He won't tell me. He came home at the right time, and I didn't know until Patterson called." Her voice was controlled but fraying at the edges. "He's not talking to me about it. He barely talks to me about anything. I thought you should know." "I'll call him. I've tried calling him. I'll try again." He pushed out through the store's front door into the afternoon heat. "Dana, is he okay? Is there anything you're actually worried about?" A pause. I'm worried that he's pulling away from both of us, and we're not doing enough to notice. She said it carefully, without accusation, or mostly without. I know you're working, Ethan. I'm not making this about us. I just think he needs more than we're giving him. He stood in the parking lot with the sun hitting the asphalt hard and the smell of pine resin in the hot air. I'll call him, he said again. Marcus picked up on the first ring, which was unusual enough to alarm him. Hey, Marcus said. Hey. Ethan unlocked his truck and got in. Didn't start it, just sat. Your mom called me. Silence. Marcus? I know what she said. Where were you Thursday? More silence. Then, nowhere. I just didn't go. The presentation you spent 2 weeks on. I know. The one you called me about and told me you were actually kind of excited about, even if you pretended you weren't. A long pause. I don't know. I just couldn't. I got there and I was in the parking lot and I just couldn't go in. Ethan sat with that. He didn't say the obvious things, the things about grades and responsibility and not throwing away work. He sat with it. Has that happened before? He asked. That feeling. I don't know. Marcus's voice was quiet and a little rough, the voice of someone who's been carrying something alone for longer than they should have. Maybe? How often is maybe? I don't want to talk about this on the phone. Okay, Ethan said. And then, before he could stop himself, come out here this weekend, to the estate. Thomas won't mind. I already know he won't. Come out Saturday and spend the day. I'll show you the car. A pause. Really? Really? It's worth seeing, Marcus. It's a remarkable car with a remarkable story. Another pause. Longer. He could almost feel his son deciding something. Okay, Marcus said. He told Victoria about Marcus before Saturday, partly out of courtesy and partly because he'd learned, in 11 days on her estate, that she didn't appreciate surprises arranged behind her. He found her in the East Garden again, the real one, where she spent time every morning that was more than he expected from someone with a team of groundskeepers. She was staking tomato plants with small strips of cloth, working methodically down the row. My son's coming Saturday, Ethan said. He's 15. I wanted to ask if that's all right. She looked up. Of course. He's having I don't entirely know what he's having, a hard stretch. I thought getting out of his regular environment for a day might be useful. She went back to her staking. Thomas can make up a better lunch if you tell me what he likes. He likes everything that's bad for him and pretends to be indifferent to everything that isn't. He sounds 15, she said. He very much is. She glanced up again. There was something in her expression that was quiet and a little complicated. Is his mother in the picture? Yes, we're functional. It's not always the right word, but it's the word that fits. She nodded, looking back at the tomatoes. My parents were functional, she said. For years and years they were functional. She paused. I thought that was what marriage looked like until I was old enough to understand that functional isn't the same as okay. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which turned out to be the right choice. She stood and moved down the row. He stood by the gate and watched her work and felt the particular discomfort of being in the presence of someone who was becoming a real person to him when they'd started as something else entirely. He found it easier to talk to the car than to us, she said, without looking up. She was still talking about our father. He understood that. It wasn't a leap. When I was young, he'd spend whole Sundays in the garage. I used to stand in the doorway watching him. I wanted him to invite me in. She paused. He never did. Did you ever just go in? She looked up then, with the sharp look that came when something caught her off guard. No, she said slowly. I waited. So did he, Ethan said. She stood very still for a moment with a strip of cloth in her hand. Then she looked back at the tomato plants and tied the next one without speaking. Marcus arrived Saturday morning in Dana's car. Dana dropped him at the gate and didn't come in, and Ethan was grateful for that without examining why too closely. His son had grown over the summer in the way teenage boys did, suddenly and unevenly, so that he seemed both older and younger than Ethan remembered. His face still boyish, but his frame now long-legged and broad-shouldered. They did the awkward thing for the first few minutes, the hello, how was the drive thing, the small exchanges that served as runway before they could get to anything real. Thomas appeared with 2 glasses of sweet tea without being asked and disappeared again, which elevated Thomas considerably in Ethan's estimation. He brought Marcus to the garage. He watched his son's face when he saw the Rolls-Royce. Marcus was not a car person. Not particularly, not the way Ethan was. But he stopped when he saw it. The way you stopped when you saw something that had genuine presence, that occupied its space in a way that asked you to notice. "That's real?" Marcus said. 1965, Ethan said. Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow belonged to the woman who owns this estate, her father's car. Marcus walked around it slowly, hands in his pockets, the way Ethan had walked around it that first day. Like father, like son. Something about that lodged in Ethan's chest. "How come it doesn't run?" Marcus asked. Ethan told him the story. The condensed version, the mechanical version, the version he could tell without touching what was in the letter. Marcus listened with his whole attention, which he didn't always do, and Ethan was reminded that his son was genuinely smart when something engaged him. "So someone built a system to make it look unfixable," Marcus said. "But it was actually fixable, just hidden, essentially." Marcus looked at the car. "That's kind of brilliant," he said, in the slightly reluctant way teenagers admitted things were impressive. "And kind of messed up." "Yeah," Ethan said. "Both." They worked on the car together for a while, Ethan working, Marcus watching, and occasionally handing him tools, which was how Ethan had learned from his own father before everything between them had gone wrong. He talked Marcus through what he was doing, not in a teaching way, but in the way he talked when he was thinking out loud, which was different and came more naturally. Victoria appeared in the garage doorway at midday. She looked at them, at Ethan and Marcus side by side, Marcus now lying on the creeper board and looking up at the undercarriage with a flashlight because Ethan had suggested it, and something moved across her face that she didn't try to conceal. "You must be Marcus," she said. Marcus rolled out from under the car and sat up. He had a smear of grease on his cheekbone that he didn't know about. He looked at Victoria and said, with the blunt directness of a 15-year-old, "Are you the one who owns this car?" "I am," she said. "It's incredible." No qualifying reluctance this time. "My dad says the guy who owned it before knew more about it than the people who built it." Victoria's expression shifted in a way that was small but legible, at least to Ethan. "He did," she said. He was that kind of person, completely capable of things, just not always capable of the right things. Marcus looked at her for a moment with the frank, slightly uncomfortable assessment that teenagers sometimes aimed at adults. "Was he your dad?" "Yes." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, exactly the way Ethan had said it to her on his first day, naturally and without ceremony. "Thank you," Victoria said, and this time the condolences received nod was real. Thomas appeared behind her with a tray, and they ate lunch in the garden, the East Garden, the real one. The 4 of them in a loose arrangement around the table with sandwiches and fruit and another round of sweet tea, and the conversation went places Ethan hadn't planned for it to go. Marcus asked Victoria about the estate's history, which led to a 20-minute story about a legal dispute in the 1890s that was genuinely interesting and which Marcus followed with genuine attention. Victoria asked Marcus about school, and he told her about the presentation he hadn't given, with a directness that surprised Ethan. He hadn't expected Marcus to volunteer it. "I got there and I just froze," Marcus said. "I don't really know why." Victoria considered him seriously. "That happens to people who care too much what they do," she said. "The ones who don't care don't freeze. The ones who need it to be good sometimes can't move." Marcus looked at her. Yeah, he said. "Yeah, that's kind of what it felt like." "You'll give the presentation," she said matter-of-factly. "Not because it's required, but because you made something you think is good, and it deserves to be said." She paused. "Just get out of the parking lot." Ethan looked at his son across the table, and Marcus looked back at him briefly, and they didn't say anything, but the look held something that other looks between them recently hadn't. After lunch, Marcus went back to the garage on his own to look at the car some more. Ethan stayed at the table with Victoria, finishing his tea. "He's a good kid," she said. He is. Ethan turned his glass in his hands. I don't always know how to tell him that in a way that he can hear. She looked out at the garden. My father never told me at all, she said. Not once, not directly. So whatever you're doing, you're already ahead. He thought about that. It didn't make him feel better exactly, but it felt like something he needed to know. Marcus left at 5, and when Dana pulled up to the gate and Marcus put his bag in the car, he turned back to Ethan and for a moment looked his age. Not 15 going on something older, just 15 with everything that meant. Thanks, Dad, he said. For today. Ethan put his hand on the back of Marcus's neck, briefly, the way he used to when Marcus was small. Any time, he said. I mean that. Marcus got in the car. Dana's window came down. He seems better, she said to Ethan quietly. Yeah, Ethan said. Me too, maybe. She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly. Good, she said, and drove away. Bamt. He was closing up the garage that evening when he found the note. It was on his workbench, under a wrench he hadn't put there. He was specific about his tools, and someone had moved it. The note was folded once, his name on the front in handwriting he didn't recognize. He opened it. There were 2 letters, it said. The one you found wasn't the only one. T, just that. Just those 2 lines and the initial. Thomas. Ethan stood in the empty garage with the note in his hand and the work lights humming and the Rolls-Royce sitting silent in the corner. He read the 2 lines again. There were 2 letters. He looked at the car. He thought about a man who had built a hiding place with extraordinary precision, a man who thought in layers and systems, a man who operated through objects and gestures and things he put down rather than handed to people, a man who had, maybe, more than one thing to say. He folded the note. He put it in his shirt pocket. He turned off the lights. He walked back to the carriage house in the dark and sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the floor for a long time. Tomorrow, he was going to have to take the car apart more thoroughly than he had, and whatever he found, he was going to have to decide what to do with it. And this time, he was less certain than he'd been the first time that the answer was simple. The first letter had been addressed to Victoria. He didn't yet know whose name was on the second one. He found Thomas the next morning before breakfast. The older man was in the kitchen garden on the north side of the house, the utilitarian one that nobody but Thomas seemed to use, cutting herbs with a small knife and laying them in a flat basket with the focused quiet of someone who had been doing this particular thing for 30 years. The morning was still cool. The mist hadn't fully lifted from the low places in the lawn, and the light came in sideways through the pecan trees at the property's edge, the kind of light that made ordinary things look considered. Ethan stood at the garden's edge and waited until Thomas looked up. There were 2 letters, Ethan said. Thomas set his knife down in the basket. He didn't look surprised. He'd left the note, after all, which meant he'd been waiting for this conversation. Yes, he said. How do you know? Thomas picked up his basket and came to the garden's edge, stopping a few feet from Ethan. He was a man who chose his distances carefully. Because I saw him build the compartment, he said. Mr. Ashford, about 3 months before he died. I came into the garage late. I'd forgotten my jacket, and he was behind the dashboard. He didn't hear me come in. I stood there a moment and then I backed out before he saw me. He paused. It wasn't my business. But you saw 2 envelopes. I saw him working with 2 envelopes. I couldn't read the names. He had them on the workbench beside him, and he moved to block them when he turned, but I was already gone. Thomas looked at him steadily. I didn't tell Ms. Victoria because I didn't know what was in the first one. I didn't know if the second would... I didn't know if it would help or make things worse. And now? Now I think you should look. He picked up his basket. Whatever he put in there, he put there for a reason. He was not a man who did things without reasons. You know whose name is on the second envelope, Ethan said. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. The mist shifted somewhere out on the lawn. A bird started up in the pecan trees. No, Thomas said, and he said it in the particular way of a man who has decided what the true answer is and has decided not to give it. I didn't see. He went back inside with his herbs, and Ethan stood in the garden alone and felt the specific weight of a situation that had gotten bigger than the job description. Protect. He went to the garage and he went slowly, which was how he went when he was thinking. The Rolls-Royce sat in the same position it had occupied for 7 years and 11 days of Ethan's company, silver blue and enormous and patient in the way that objects outlasting their owners are patient. He stood in front of it for a while without doing anything. He had the note in his shirt pocket again. He'd put it back there after reading it 4 more times the night before, which had not helped him understand it any better, but had given his hands something to do while his mind worked. The question was not whether to look. He was already certain he was going to look, had been certain since he'd stood in the parking lot of the Carver grocery store reading the note by the light of his truck's interior bulb. The question was what he'd do with what he found. The first letter had been simple in its ethics. It was addressed to Victoria, it was her father's property, it was his job to give it to her, clean and clear, and he hadn't hesitated. A second letter changed the geometry. It meant William Ashford had 2 things to say to 2 different people, which meant the situation in this family was not a single unresolved thread, but a tangle. And tangles had ends that pulled on other ends. He thought about what Victoria had told him, about her father's silences, about standing in the garage doorway, waiting to be invited in. He thought about Thomas saying he found it easier to put things down than to hand them to people. He thought about a man who drove his car alone every Sunday morning before the house woke up, who built a hiding place precise enough to survive 14 experts, who planned whatever this was with the same care he brought to the engine bay. A man like that doesn't write 1 letter. A man like that accounts for everything he can account for. Ethan put on his work gloves and opened the car door. It took him 2 hours. He had to go further into the dashboard structure than he'd gone before, removing panels he hadn't needed to remove for the ignition modification, going deeper into the architecture of the car, into the spaces between spaces, the voids that the car's designers had left unfilled, and that William Ashford had apparently spent some portion of the last months of his life reconsidering. The second compartment was behind the first, not adjacent, behind, set further back into the dash, accessible only once you'd removed the components that concealed the first. It was smaller than the first and more deliberately hidden. If you found the first and stopped looking, you'd never find the second, which was, Ethan understood, entirely the point. The second letter was meant to be found only by someone who didn't stop. He sat back on his heels and looked at the envelope in his hand, the wax seal, the handwriting, precise and old-fashioned, same as before. He turned it over. The name on the front was not one he recognized. For Ethan, it said. He stayed completely still for a long time. Not for whoever finds this. Not to the mechanic. Not any generalization or placeholder. For Ethan. His name. His specific name. He sat on the garage floor with the car's door open above him and the work lights throwing their flat white light across everything, and he thought, this is not possible. Because for it to be possible, William Ashford would have had to know. 3 months before his death, when he'd built this compartment, when he'd written this letter, that a man named Ethan would one day be the one to find it, which meant William Ashford had known who he was. The thought arrived in pieces, the way a large thing sometimes had to arrive, not all at once but in stages, the mind catching up to what the body already understood. Because if William Ashford had known his name, then the painful connection that Ethan had carried for more than 2 decades, the buried thing, the thing he'd never told anyone on this estate, the thing he told himself was ancient history and irrelevant and best left where it was not buried as deep as he'd believed. He sat on the floor of the garage for a long time before he moved. He was 7 years old when he first heard the name Ashford. That required going back, which he generally didn't do. But sitting in the garage on the concrete floor with an impossible envelope in his hands, he went back. His father, Frank Walker, had worked as a groundskeeper for various estates in and around central Georgia his whole adult life. Not this estate, a different one, smaller, belonging to a family named Castlemore. But in the world of old Georgia properties, people talked, and groundskeepers knew each other, and there was a network of the employed and the employing that operated in ways invisible to outsiders. Frank Walker had been, by most measures, not a good father. He was present in the physical sense, and absent in almost every other. He drank, not dramatically but consistently, the way men drank when they'd found something that made the gap between their life and what they'd imagined for themselves slightly less visible. He didn't hit. He didn't rage. He just wasn't there, even when he was standing in front of you. When Ethan was 17, Frank Walker had a crisis that Ethan never fully understood. Something to do with money, with a loan that had gone wrong, with a debt that had found a creditor with patience but not infinite patience. Ethan didn't know the details then, and still didn't know them fully. What he knew was that one spring evening, when he was 17 and in the worst year of his relationship with his father, a man had come to their house. He'd been tall, gray at the temples, driven himself in a silver blue car that Ethan had stood in the yard and looked at while the man was inside with his father. They talked for a long time, an hour, maybe more. When the man left, his father had been different, not fixed, but the particular panic that had been living in the house for weeks had subsided. Ethan had never known who the man was. He'd asked his father once, and his father had given the kind of non-answer that shut down further asking. The silver blue car had gone back down their road, and the crisis had passed and life had resumed in its usual gray way, and Ethan had eventually stopped thinking about it. Now, sitting on the garage floor of the Ashford estate 33 years later, he understood that he had been looking at William Ashford's Rolls-Royce. He understood that William Ashford, in the last months of his life, had known enough about Ethan Walker to put his name on an envelope and hide it in a car. He understood that whatever had passed between William Ashford and Frank Walker on that spring evening in 1993 had not been finished. He stood up. His knees ached from the concrete. He held the envelope. He did not open it. He couldn't open it yet, not because he didn't want to, because he desperately wanted to, but because he needed to think about what he was doing and what it meant, and whether he had the right to open something addressed to him by a man who had apparently been watching the trajectory of his life from a distance. He set the envelope on the workbench. He went to the carriage house and sat in the chair by the window and stared at the cypress pond for 40 minutes. Then he went back and opened it. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, the script slightly less controlled than it must have been when the man was younger and less sick. Because he had been sick, Ethan could see that in the handwriting, the places where the pen had trembled slightly and been steadied by will. 2 pages, densely written, and Ethan read them once fast and then again slowly, and by the end of the second reading he was sitting in the driver's seat of the Rolls-Royce with the door open and the letter on the steering wheel in front of him. He would not say, then or later, exactly what was in the letter. Some things were not for saying. But what it told him, in William Ashford's precise and slightly trembling hand, was this: that Frank Walker, in the spring of 1993, had come to William Ashford in desperation and had told him something. Something that connected the two men in a way that Ethan had never known about. That William Ashford had helped, not out of charity, but out of obligation, because he had been the cause of part of Frank Walker's trouble, though indirectly and without intent, and in a manner he'd only understood years after the fact. That he had watched Ethan Walker's life from a distance, not intrusively, but with the attention of a man who felt a responsibility he didn't know how to act on directly. That he had seen what Ethan had built, the garage, the reputation, the skill, and had arranged, in the last months of his life, for Gerald Fitch to have his name available should anyone on the estate need a mechanic. That William Ashford had, in other words, engineered this. Not the whole thing. Not the car's silence, which had come from whatever private grief had moved him to stop it, but the line of connection that had brought Ethan to this estate. That had not been coincidence. The last paragraph of the letter said, "I do not ask you to forgive what I did not do enough of, or to think better of me than I deserve. I ask only that you look at my daughter without the history between our families clouding what you see. She has her mother's stubbornness and my inability to say the important things at the right time. She will need someone who is willing to say them for her until she learns how. I believe you are that kind of person. I'm sorry I waited too long to know you properly." Ethan sat in the driver's seat of the dead man's car and read that last paragraph 3 times. The leather of the seat was warm from the work lights. The car smelled of age and oil and something floral that had probably been there since the last time William Ashford sat in it, the morning he'd come back and parked it and walked past his daughter without speaking. Ethan looked at his own hands on the steering wheel. He thought about Gerald Fitch, who he'd always assumed had recommended him out of genuine professional regard, and who had apparently also been part of something he hadn't known he was part of. He thought about the morning the call had come in, the Georgia area code, Renata Cole's clipped efficiency, the number that had come through 40 seconds after his practical question about money. He thought about how he'd almost let it go to voicemail because he didn't trust Tuesdays. He thought about Thomas saying he found it easier to put things down than to hand them to people, and understood now that the man had been describing William Ashford's relationship with his own guilt as much as his relationship with his family. He thought about his father, Frank Walker, who was 73 now and lived in a veterans assisted living facility outside Augusta, and with whom Ethan spoke approximately 4 times a year in conversations that were careful and brief and said nothing that mattered. Who had a secret he'd apparently carried for 33 years and had never once handed to his son. Like father, like absent father, he sat in the car for a long time. He told Victoria that evening. He didn't plan to. He'd spent the afternoon telling himself he needed more time, needed to think through what to say and how to say it, and what the right order of information was. He'd convinced himself he'd wait until morning. Then she appeared in the garage doorway at 7 in the evening with 2 glasses of sweet tea this time, and she looked at the Rolls-Royce and then at him, and she said, "You found something else." And he understood that she'd known there was more, had maybe known for days the way people sometimes knew things before they found out. He told her. He told her about the second compartment. He told her the envelope had his name on it. He told her he'd read the letter, and he told her as plainly and carefully as he could what it said, leaving out the final paragraph, which was his, and telling her the rest. She stood with her sweet tea and she listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "He arranged for you to come here," she said. "Gerald Fitch worked for your family's estate manager 15 years ago. One conversation, apparently. Your father kept the name." She set her sweet tea down on the workbench, precisely, like someone setting down something fragile. "He knew your father." "He knew my father. I didn't know he knew my father. I didn't know they'd ever met." Ethan paused. "I'm still working out what that means." He felt responsible for something. She wasn't asking. She was putting it together in front of him, the way she processed things, out loud but carefully, each word tested before it was placed. "My father. He felt he owed your family something. That's what the letter says. And he paid it by, what? Arranging for you to find a car a dead man hid a letter in. More or less." She looked at him. Her expression was doing something complicated, things overlapping and shifting, none of them settling into anything he could name. "Are you angry?" she asked. The question surprised him. He thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I feel maneuvered, and I understand why, mostly, which makes it harder to just be angry." "He did that," she said, and for a moment something came through her voice that was not the controlled, compressed version of herself he'd come to know. Something rawer. He managed situations instead of being in them. He arranged things and orchestrated things, and trusted that the outcome would stand in for the conversation he didn't know how to have. She stopped. "He did it with me my whole life. And with my father, apparently. And with you. And with me." They stood in the garage with the work lights and the silence and the car that had been carrying all of this inside it for 7 years, and neither of them said anything for a while. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "About the letter?" "About your father." He hadn't expected that to be the question, even though it was obviously the question. He looked at the Rolls-Royce. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I haven't talked to my father about anything real in probably 15 years. We don't fight. We just don't go there." "He has a secret he kept from you for 33 years. "Yes." "Doesn't that make you want to go there?" "It makes me want to not go there," he said, which was a clumsy way to put it, but was the exact truth. Which is different, but maybe the same thing, eventually. Victoria picked her tea back up. She looked at the car, at the passenger door, specifically, which was the door Ethan had been sitting in when he read the letter. "Did he say anything about me?" she asked, quietly, Not performing casualness, but genuinely trying to be casual about something she wasn't. Ethan looked at her. She was looking at the car. He thought about the last paragraph. She has her mother's stubbornness and my inability to say the important things at the right time. He said you deserved better than he gave you, Ethan said. It was true. It was the part of the last paragraph he could give her. She nodded slowly. Her jaw was set in the specific way of someone receiving news they'd expected and still needed a moment to absorb. He was right about that, she said. Yes, Ethan said. He was. He called his father the next morning, not because he'd fully decided to, but because the alternative was continuing to not call, which he'd been doing for years and which had served nobody. Frank Walker answered on the third ring, sounding the way he usually sounded, cautious, a little distant, braced for something without knowing what. Ethan. A pause. Everything all right? Fine, Ethan said. I'm working a job out near Macon, a restoration. That right. Old Rolls-Royce. Belonged to a man named William Ashford. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a man who didn't recognize a name. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that has weight, that fills up space in a specific way. Dad? Ethan said. I heard you, his father said. Then say something. Another pause. Longer. Ethan stood outside the carriage house with the morning light coming over the pecan trees and waited. He was a good man, his father said finally. His voice was different, thinner than usual, something stripped back in it. William Ashford. He was a better man than he gave himself credit for, and better than I deserved. I need you to tell me, Ethan said, what he told you, what happened. I need to know. Ethan, I'm standing on his estate. I've been in his car. I've read a letter he wrote me, a letter with my name on it that he hid in his car 3 months before he died. Ethan kept his voice level, which took effort. He knew things about my life that I didn't know he knew, and you knew why, and you didn't tell me. So I need you to tell me now. The silence was very long this time. When can you come? His father said. I can't come right now. I have work I need to finish. Then come after. Come when you're done. A pause. I should have told you a long time ago. I know that. I'm not going to argue that I handled it right. Good, Ethan said. Because you didn't. No, his father said. I didn't. They stayed on the phone for another minute without saying much, which was unusual. Their silences were usually efficient, conclusions that both of them could see coming and didn't bother prolonging. This silence was different. This one had something living in it. He had a daughter, Frank Walker said before Ethan could hang up. Victoria. I remember him talking about her. He talked about her a lot, actually, when he'd had a couple of drinks and his guard came down. A pause. He said she was the best thing he'd ever made and the thing he'd done the least justice to. Ethan said nothing. Is she there? His father asked. She lives here. What is she like? Ethan looked out at the lawn, at the cypress pond in the distance, at the east garden wall just visible past the corner of the house. She's complicated, he said. Like her father. That sounds about right, Frank Walker said, and there was something in his voice that was tired and a little tender and 33 years deep. That sounds exactly right. He told Victoria about the call that evening. Not all of it. He was still holding some of it close, the way you held something that had just been handed back to you after a long time and needed to be examined before it could be shared. But he told her he'd called. They were in the East Garden, both of them, because that was where they'd started going when they needed somewhere that wasn't the garage and wasn't the house. Victoria had been deadheading the roses along the south wall, and Ethan had come in and sat on the bench near the tomatoes, and she'd kept working, and they'd talked the way they'd been increasingly talking, without too much effort, without the old formality, with the specific ease of people who have been through something together and are figuring out what that means. He's going to tell me what he knows, Ethan said, after I finish here. Good. She stripped a dead bloom from the nearest rose, her movements sure and quick. You deserved to know years ago. Yes. He paused. Your father and mine were connected in a way neither of their children knew about. That's strange to sit with. My father was connected to a lot of things he didn't tell me about, she said, without bitterness exactly. Something that had moved past bitterness into a wider, flatter country. He ran his life in compartments. She glanced back at Ethan. Apparently, literally, he almost smiled. 2 of them. She turned back to the roses. My mother is coming next week, she said, which was not a change of subject, though it sounded like one. I called her after the letter. She lives in Charleston. We haven't spoken properly in 4 years. Ethan looked at her back, the careful set of her shoulders. How did that go? Awkwardly, she said. Necessary things are usually awkward. She paused. She's going to stay for a few days. I don't know what we're going to say to each other. Another pause, shorter. I don't know if we have a language anymore. We used to, and then we stopped using it, and I don't know if you can get that back. I think you can, Ethan said. I think it comes back slowly if you keep showing up. She looked at him over her shoulder. Speaking from experience? He thought about Marcus, about the careful ice-crossing conversations, about the look across the lunch table, about thanks, Dad, and a hand on the back of a boy's neck. Working on it, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, longer than was strictly conversational, and then turned back to her roses. The garden was quiet except for the shears and the mockingbird, which apparently lived on this property permanently and was not planning to leave. Do you know what my father's letter said to me? Victoria said. She was still facing the roses. The whole of it, not just what I told you? No, Ethan said. He apologized for a lot of things. The silences, the distances, years of being in the same house and not actually being there. Her shears paused. He said he loved me in the only language he knew, which was the language of things, of fixing and restoring and building. He said he understood it wasn't enough. He said he was sorry he didn't learn more languages. The shears resumed. And then he said, she continued, her voice carefully even, that the car was mine to do with what I wanted, that he'd locked it because he couldn't bear the thought of it belonging to someone who didn't know its history, but that he'd left the letter so that whoever came to find the problem would also find the reason, and that whoever was patient enough and honest enough to look past what every expert had said and search for what was actually true, that was the person he trusted to take care of us. Ethan sat on the bench and felt the weight of that settle over him. Us, he said, meaning you and the car. That's what I thought at first. She deadheaded another bloom. Now I think he meant something else by it. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask her to. The evening light came over the garden wall in long angles, catching the roses and the tomato plants and the edge of Victoria Ashford's profile as she moved along the row, and Ethan Walker sat on the bench and turned over the pieces of a story that had apparently been in motion since before he understood himself as a character in it. The car still didn't run. He still had work to do. But under the garden's evening light, with the mockingbird cycling through all its borrowed voices, something in the situation had shifted in a way that felt less like the middle of a mystery and more like the beginning of something he didn't yet have a name for. He stayed in the garden until the light was fully gone. Eleanor Ashford arrived on a Wednesday. Ethan knew she was coming because Victoria had mentioned it twice more after that evening in the garden. Once in passing, the way you mentioned something you were nervous about but didn't want to appear nervous about, and once directly, the morning before, standing in the garage doorway with her coffee and saying, "My mother gets in tomorrow afternoon. I may be unavailable for part of the day." "I'll be fine," Ethan said. He was reassembling the dashboard components with the careful patience the work required. "I don't need supervising." "I'm not supervising you. I know. I'm saying you don't have to manage both things at once." She'd looked at him for a moment with something that was either appreciation or irritation, and then gone back inside, which could have been either. He was in the garage when the car arrived, a hired car, black, which pulled around the front drive at 2 in the afternoon. He wasn't watching for it. He heard it through the open garage door, and then he heard voices, and he kept his eyes on the fuel line he was tracing and gave the situation whatever privacy it had. What he heard from across the distance of the side yard was not a warm reunion. It was not cold either. It was the sound of two people who had once known each other very well and were now carefully figuring out if any of that was still accessible. Brief, measured exchanges. A pause that went long enough to be significant. Then footsteps on the porch and the front door. Thomas appeared in the garage 20 minutes later with a tray. He set it on the workbench without being asked. "How does she seem?" Ethan said without looking up. "Ms. Victoria?" Thomas set the tray down. Tray, like someone standing on a diving board who hasn't decided yet. Ethan nodded. That tracked. "Mrs. Ashford is different than I remembered," Thomas said. He said it carefully, the way he said most things. Older, obviously, but also softer, maybe. Time does that to some people. He paused. Not all. What was she like before? When the family was together? Thomas thought about it. He was not a man who gave careless answers. She and Mr. Ashford were two people who were very good at the same things and very bad at the same things, he said finally. They were both proud, both used to being the competent one in any room. When you put two people like that together, either they balance each other or they compete. He picked up the empty water glass from the tray. They competed, quietly and for a long time, but that's what it was. And Victoria got caught in the middle. Victoria learned to be invisible, Thomas said, which is its own kind of damage. He left, and Ethan sat with that for a while before going back to the fuel line. He didn't see Victoria until the following morning. She came to the garage at her usual hour. He'd noticed she had usual hours now, patterns that had established themselves over the weeks without either of them remarking on it, but she looked like she'd slept badly, which was visible in the set of her jaw and the specific flatness behind her eyes that came from a night of thinking instead of resting. She brought 2 coffees this time. She handed him one without commenting on the gesture, and he took it without commenting either, which was its own kind of conversation. "How did it go?" he asked. "We didn't fight," she said. "That's the best I can say about yesterday." "That's something." "It's less than something. Not fighting is not the same as talking." She sat on the stool. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "We had dinner. We talked about the estate and the drive from Charleston and whether it was going to rain this week. We watched an hour of television in the same room and then said goodnight. First nights are often like that." "I know." She stared at the Rolls-Royce. "I've been thinking about what you said, about language coming back if you keep showing up. I'm trying to believe that. It's not a quick process." "No." A pause. "She looks old." "My mother. I don't mean that unkindly. I mean it surprised me. In my head, she's been the same age she was the last time I really looked at her, which was apparently 4 years ago, and she isn't." She paused again. "It made me feel like I'd been wasting time in a way that my father's letter didn't quite manage to." "Sometimes the living make the point better than the dead can," Ethan said. She looked at him. "That's either very wise or very obvious." "Probably both." She almost smiled. The shape of it again, the same shape as before, still not fully committing, but closer. "She wants to see the car," Victoria said. Ethan looked up. "Your mother?" "She knows it wouldn't run. She never knew why. I didn't tell her about the letter, not yet, not over the phone, but she knows I called her because something had happened, and she knows it had something to do with your work here." She looked at the Rolls. "She and my father were divorced for 11 years before he died. She has more complicated feelings about him than I do, which is saying something, but she also loved him for 20 years first. When does she want to come?" "Whenever you say it's all right." He looked at the car, at the work that remained, at the dashboard still partially open, at the notes on his workbench that mapped what he'd found and what still needed doing. "Give me until this afternoon," he said. "I want to have the interior put back together before anyone else sees it opened up." Victoria nodded. She drank her coffee. She stayed on the stool for another 10 minutes without speaking, which was a thing she'd started doing, staying in the garage without needing to talk, the way you sat in a room where you felt comfortable without needing to perform comfort. He didn't mind it. He'd come to expect it. When she left her empty cup on the workbench. That too had become a pattern. He moved it to the corner with the others and went back to work. Eleanor Ashford was 71, silver-haired, and looked at the 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. The way people looked at things that had been part of a dream they'd woken from and weren't sure was worth mourning. She was shorter than her daughter and carried herself differently. Less armor, more weariness, but the weariness of someone who'd earned it rather than someone who'd surrendered. She shook Ethan's hand with a firm grip and looked at him directly in a way that reminded him of Victoria, or rather reminded him that Victoria had come by that look honestly. "You're the one who found the letter," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't ma'am me. I'm Eleanor." She looked back at the car. "May I?" She walked around it slowly, and Ethan watched her from a respectful distance. Victoria stood near the garage door, slightly apart from both of them, in the position of someone watching two parts of her life occupy the same space and not quite knowing what to do with her hands. Eleanor stopped at the driver's side door. She put one hand on the roof of the car, not on the chrome, on the body, flat-palmed, and held it there for a moment. "He drove this car the morning of our first date," she said. "Not this car specifically. He didn't buy this one until years later, but a Rolls-Royce, because he'd borrowed one from a colleague and wanted to make an impression." She didn't look at Ethan or Victoria when she said it. She was talking to the car, or to herself, or to someone who wasn't in the room anymore. "He made an impression. That was William. He knew exactly how to arrange the thing he wanted you to see." "And what he didn't want you to see," Victoria said from the door. Eleanor looked at her daughter. Something passed between them, something old and layered, the compressed shorthand of a shared history. "That too," she said. She came away from the car and looked at Ethan with the direct look again. "The letter," she said. "Victoria told me, some of it, that it was an apology." "That's the heart of it, yes." "Was it a good one?" The question surprised him. He thought about how to answer it honestly. "I think it was the best he could do," he said. "Whether that was good enough is not my call." Eleanor considered that. Then she looked at Victoria. "That's a fair answer," she said. Victoria said nothing. She was looking at the car. "He owed me one too," Eleanor said, matter-of-factly. Not bitter, just stating a thing. "Not the same as yours, Victoria. A different one. We had our own debts." She paused. "He never paid them. I'd made my peace with that." She paused again. "Mostly." "What would you have wanted him to say?" Ethan asked. He asked it carefully, the way he asked things when he genuinely wanted to know and was aware that the question was not small. Eleanor thought about it for long enough that he wondered if she was going to answer. "That he knew I tried," she said finally. "That he understood I was doing my best with what I had, even when my best wasn't right. I didn't need grand apologies. I needed acknowledgement, that I had been there, that I had mattered in the way I was trying to matter, not just in the ways that were convenient for him." She looked at her daughter. "We both needed that." Victoria was very still. "I know," Victoria said. It came out low and a little rough. "I know, Mom." It was the first time Ethan had heard her say that word, Mom. And the simplicity of it, the small private surrender in it, sat in the garage like something breakable. Eleanor moved to her daughter and put her hand on Victoria's arm. Not a hug. Neither of them were there yet. It wasn't that kind of reunion. It was the reunion of people who had to learn each other again first. But a hand on an arm, firm and present. "Show me the garden," Eleanor said. "Thomas says you've been keeping it yourself." "Mostly." "Your grandmother would have liked that." Eleanor steered her daughter gently toward the door. "She always said you had her hands." They went out into the afternoon, and Ethan heard their voices diminish toward the east garden wall, and then just the mockingbird, and then nothing but the work lights humming. He turned back to the car. There was still a lot to do. Masab. The restoration itself, the mechanical restoration, the part of this that was his actual job, was not simple even once he'd understood the modification and documented the second compartment and delivered what needed delivering. William Ashford had maintained the car obsessively, yes, but 7 years of sitting had still done what 7 years of sitting always did. Seals had dried. Fuel lines needed flushing. The battery was long dead, and the replacement he'd ordered from a specialist supplier had taken 11 days to arrive. The carburetor needed cleaning with a patience that could not be hurried without damaging things. He worked through it systematically, the way he worked through everything. One system at a time, back to front, not moving on until each component had been tested and confirmed. He talked to Ray twice more, walking through specifics, and Ray talked him through a quirk of the 1965 fuel delivery system that he'd have found eventually, but that Ray had seen before and could name in 30 seconds. The work was good. It was the kind of work that needed your whole mind, and he gave it that, and it kept the larger questions at bay during the hours when he needed them kept at bay. In the evenings, those questions came back. The letter, his father, the arrangement William Ashford had made decades ago, the odd, tilted feeling of being in a situation that someone else had designed with you as a character without your knowledge. But the evenings also had their own rhythms now, which had changed without his quite noticing when the change had happened. Victoria came to the garage most evenings, sometimes with tea, sometimes with wine, once with 2 actual plates of food, because Thomas had made too much and she'd said, without particular ceremony, "You may as well eat here." They talked. They argued, occasionally, because she was not a woman who backed down from disagreement, and he was not a man who said things he didn't mean just to smooth the surface. They found, in the arguing, that they could argue without it meaning something bad, which was rarer than it sounded. He learned things about her gradually, the way you learn someone when they let you without making a performance of the letting. She had a graduate degree in architectural history that she'd never used because her father had needed her in the family business at a specific moment, and she'd said yes when she should have said no, and had not said no to much else afterward. She had one close friend, a woman named Sylvie, in Atlanta, whom she called every Sunday, and who apparently knew more about the estate situation than anyone else in Victoria's life. She was a bad sleeper. She read everything and retained all of it, and occasionally said things that revealed this in ways she didn't seem to notice. She had inherited her father's hands, capable, precise, and her mother's stubbornness, exactly as the letter had said. She was not an easy person, and she knew it, and she did not apologize for it, which Ethan found more refreshing than he'd expected to. He learned that she'd been engaged once, 6 years ago, to a man from an Atlanta family, and that it had ended badly without her being willing to say exactly why, except that she'd said once, obliquely, "He wanted the version of me that shows up at events, not the one that spends Saturday morning in the dirt." Ethan had understood that completely and hadn't pushed. She was learning things about him too, he knew, though she was more careful about it, more deliberate in her questions, waiting longer before she asked, as though she was assembling a picture piece by piece and wanted to be sure she was reading each piece correctly before placing it. She asked about Marcus on the Thursday of Eleanor's visit. They were in the garden, the usual spot, and the evening light was doing the sideways thing through the pecan trees. "Has he done the presentation yet?" she asked. "Did it Monday." Ethan was pulling up a weed at the edge of the tomato bed because his hands liked to be busy, and weeding was something you could do in a garden without anyone thinking you were overstepping. "Got a 91. Good." "He called me after, which he doesn't always do." He paused. He sounded lighter. I don't know if it was the grade or something else. Maybe both. Maybe. He pulled another weed. "He wants to come back out here before I'm done. Said he wants to hear the car run." Victoria looked at him with an expression he was starting to be able to read, the one that was actually about something it didn't appear to be about. "Does he know?" she asked. "About the letters? About what your father's connection to mine was?" "Not yet. I haven't figured out how to explain it to him, partly because I'm still explaining it to myself." "You should bring him when you come back," she said. "When you come to finish." She paused, and he heard the assumption embedded in the sentence, "when you come back." And she heard it too, and neither of them addressed it, but it sat there in the evening air like something placed deliberately. "I'll ask him," Ethan said. Eleanor stayed for 4 days. Ethan observed their progress the way he observed the car's progress, by small signs, by the texture of things changing incrementally rather than dramatically. On the second day, they argued over dinner about something to do with the estate's trust structure, voices slightly raised, and Ethan, eating in the carriage house, heard the argument through the open window and was reassured by it. Arguing meant they'd gotten past the careful television and the weather. On the third day, Victoria showed her mother the garage and the car, and Ethan came in to find them standing together at the front of the Rolls-Royce, with Eleanor's hand on the hood and Victoria standing close enough that their arms were touching. He turned around quietly and came back in 20 minutes. On the fourth day, the morning Eleanor was leaving, Ethan was in the garage at 7 when Victoria appeared at the door earlier than usual. "She wants to say goodbye to you," Victoria said. He put down his tools and went outside. Eleanor was standing by the hired car with her bag, dressed for travel, looking like a woman who had done what she'd come to do and was ready to go. "The car," she said when he came to her. "You'll finish it?" "Yes. And it'll actually run." "It'll run." She looked at him with the direct look. "She says you're the best she's seen at this kind of work." She didn't say it like a compliment. She said it like a fact, which is more reliable. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "She also," Eleanor said more quietly, "talks about you differently than she talks about most people." "We've spent a lot of time in a garage together," Ethan said carefully. "Yes." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "My husband spent 30 years being the cleverest person in every room he entered. He was usually right about that. What he wasn't clever enough to understand was that being the cleverest person in the room doesn't mean you're the most important one." She looked at the garage. "Victoria has grown up thinking those things are the same. Watching her watch you, I think she's starting to figure out they aren't." He didn't have anything to say to that either. His talent for running out of responses in conversations on this property had apparently not diminished. Eleanor shook his hand. "Fix the car, Mr. Walker," she said, "and whatever else needs fixing while you're at it." She got in the car. Victoria stood at the edge of the drive and watched it go down the long driveway and through the magnolias until it disappeared, and Ethan stood a few feet behind her and let the moment be what it was. "You okay?" he said when the car was fully gone. "No," she said, "but I think that's the right kind of not okay." She turned around. Her eyes were dry. She had a formidable grip on herself, but her face was open in the way it had been open since the night in the garage when she'd read the letter. She said she's coming back in a month. "We have things to work through." She paused. "We've never said that out loud before, that we have things to work through." "That's a start." "Yes." She looked at the garage. "How much longer do you need?" He thought about it honestly. 4 or 5 days, maybe less if the fuel system cooperates. She nodded. She looked at the garage again for a moment, then back at him. "What happens when you're done?" she asked. Not the version of the question that was about the car. He understood that. "I go home," he said. He said it plainly, because she deserved plain. "I visit my father. I have a conversation that should have happened 20 years ago." He paused. "And then I figure out what comes after that. That's a lot of things to figure out. I've been putting them off long enough," he said. "All of them." She held his look for a moment in the same long way she had the previous week in the garden. Then she said, "I'll let you get back to work," and went inside, and Ethan stood in the drive for a moment before going back to the garage. The mockingbird was in the magnolias by the gate now, as though it had been watching the car leave and had opinions about it. So, he called Marcus that evening and asked if he wanted to come when the car was ready. "When it actually runs?" Marcus said. "When it actually runs. Yeah." A pause. "Yeah, I want to be there for that." "Bring your good shoes. It's an occasion." "Dad, I don't have good shoes." "Then bring whatever you have." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, I want to talk to you about some things. Not tonight. In person, when I see you next. About your grandfather. About some family stuff you should probably know." A pause on the other end. Not the guarded pause from before. Something more open. "Okay," Marcus said. "Is it bad stuff?" "Some of it's complicated. I think some of it is actually good in a way, but it's a long story." "I like long stories." "I know you do." Ethan looked out the carriage house window, at the dark lawn, the way he'd looked out that window dozens of times over the past weeks. The pond was invisible in the dark, but he knew where it was. "You got that from your grandmother, by the way. She could hold a story in her head the way other people can't." "I didn't know that," Marcus said. "There's a lot I haven't told you. I'm working on changing that." "Okay," Marcus said again. Simpler this time. More settled. Like someone who'd been waiting to hear that and was relieved it was finally coming. On the fifth to last day of work, Ethan found himself in the garage late, past 9, the estate fully dark and quiet outside, finishing the fuel system flush that had to sit overnight. He was washing his hands at the utility sink in the corner when he heard footsteps, and Victoria appeared in the doorway in a light jacket, which meant she'd walked from the house on purpose rather than drifted over. She looked at the car. He could see, even from across the garage, that she was looking at it differently than she had on the first night he'd arrived. When she'd looked at it the way you looked at a wound you'd stopped touching, now she looked at it the way you looked at something you were preparing to have back. "I've been thinking about what to do with it," she said, coming in. "After. The estate sale? I'm not selling the estate." She said it with a finality that told him the decision was recent and firm. "I thought I was. I thought I needed to simplify everything, get out from under all of it, start somewhere that wasn't carrying all of this weight." She stopped near the car and put her hand on the roof, the same way her mother had, flat-palmed. "But it's not weight. It's just history. And history isn't something you get lighter by walking away from. You just carry it somewhere new." "So you're staying?" "I'm staying." She looked at him. "The car stays too. I thought I needed to decide what it meant before I could decide what to do with it. But I think it means what it's always meant. It's his. And it's mine. And those two things can both be true." Ethan dried his hands. He came to stand near the front of the car, opposite her, the hood of the Rolls-Royce between them. "It's a good car," he said. "When it runs, and it will run, it's going to be something." "Will you be here for that?" she asked. He looked at her. "I'll finish what I started," he said. "That's not quite what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. The work lights hummed. Outside, something moved in the lawn. A possum, maybe, or just the wind in the oaks. "I've got a son in Savannah and a father in Augusta and a garage I've been running for 11 years, he said. "Those aren't small things." "No," she said, "they're not. But they're also not all there is." He said it carefully, the way you said things that you'd been moving toward for weeks and had finally reached. "I'm not saying I've figured any of this out. I'm saying I haven't ruled anything out." Victoria looked at him across the car. The armor was completely gone now. Had been gone, he realized, for days, maybe longer. What was there instead was something he couldn't quite name yet, but recognized as real, which counted for more. "That's the most I've heard you say about anything that wasn't mechanical," she said. "I told you I was working on it." She almost smiled. Then she did smile. Not the almost, but the real thing. Brief and a little crooked and completely unperformed, and it changed her face in a way that made him understand what she must have looked like before she'd learned to be careful. "Good night, Ethan," she said. "Good night," he said. She walked back through the dark toward the house, and he stood in the garage and listened to her footsteps on the gravel fade, and then he turned off the work lights and stood in the dark for a moment with the car. 4 or 5 days. He had 4 or 5 days left here, and an engine to bring back from silence, and a father to call and a son to talk to, and a story that had been in motion since before he was born, and that he was only now beginning to understand the shape of. But tonight, in the dark garage, with the Rolls-Royce sitting patient and nearly ready beside him, Ethan Walker felt, not happy exactly, not anything that uncomplicated, but something he recognized, after a long time of not recognizing it, as the sensation of being in the right place. He walked back to the carriage house. Through the window, a single light was still on in the main house. He didn't look away from it for a long time. The engine started on a Thursday morning. Not dramatically. Not with fanfare or ceremony or any of the things that the moment probably deserved. Ethan had been working since 6, alone in the garage with the work lights and his coffee going cold on the workbench, running through the final checklist with the methodical patience that had defined every hour of work on this car. He'd checked the ignition system, the restored ignition system, the one without William Ashford's precise and heartbreaking modification, 3 times over 2 days. He'd checked the fuel delivery, the battery connections, the timing. He'd primed the carburetor. He'd done everything he knew how to do, and then checked it all again. At 8:17 in the morning, He sat in the driver's seat of the 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, put the key in the ignition, and turned it. The engine caught on the second try. It didn't roar. That wasn't the nature of this engine, which had been built for a different philosophy entirely, built for the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. It came to life with a sound that was deep and even and almost shockingly composed, like a voice that had been silent for 7 years and had come back knowing exactly what it wanted to say. The gauges woke up. The oil pressure climbed to where it belonged. The temperature needle began its slow arc toward operating range. Ethan sat in the driver's seat and put both hands on the steering wheel and listened. He'd started hundreds of engines over his career. He'd brought back cars that people had given up on, cars with more wrong with them than right, cars that should, by any reasonable measure, have been scrapped. He'd felt the particular satisfaction of that work many times, the clean, uncomplicated pleasure of a thing functioning that had stopped functioning, of order restored to a system that had been in disorder. This was different. He couldn't have explained exactly why, and he didn't try. He just sat in the car and let the engine run and felt the vibration of it through the steering wheel and the seat, and thought about a man he'd never met who had sat in the same seat on a Sunday morning 7 years ago and driven this car one last time and come back and parked it and gone inside, carrying whatever he carried, leaving whatever he left. The car ran. After a few minutes, Ethan got out and stood beside it and listened from the outside. The idle was steady and clean. There was no smoke from the exhaust, no unusual sounds in the valvetrain, nothing that indicated anything but an engine doing what it was built to do, doing it the way it had always done it when the man who built it back to life had been alive to maintain it. He went to the garage door and looked toward the house. He didn't have to wait long. Thomas came first, which meant Thomas had been watching for signs. He appeared around the corner of the house, with his work jacket still on, and stopped about 20 feet from the garage when he heard it. Stopped completely, the way you stopped when you heard something you'd given up expecting. He stood there for a moment. Then he came the rest of the way. He stood next to Ethan in the garage doorway, and they both listened to the engine. "Well," Thomas said. "Yeah," Ethan said. That was all. It was enough. Victoria came 5 minutes later, which meant she'd been in the house and had heard it through the walls or the windows, or maybe she'd felt it, the way you sometimes felt a change in a place you'd lived long enough. She came around the corner of the house the way Thomas had, and she stopped the way Thomas had, and for a moment she just stood in the morning light and listened. She was wearing the linen shirt and jeans again, her real clothes, not estate owner clothes. Her hair was loose, which he'd only seen a few times. She looked at the garage, at the Rolls-Royce visible inside with the engine running, and something crossed her face that Ethan didn't have a name for and didn't try to name. She walked to the garage and stood beside him. The three of them, Ethan, Thomas, Victoria, stood in the doorway and listened to William Ashford's car run for the first time in 7 years and 3 months. "It sounds exactly the same," Victoria said quietly. "How do you know?" Ethan asked. "You would have been 23 when he last drove it. I used to hear it from my window on Sunday mornings, before I was fully awake, before the day started." She was still looking at the car. "I'd know that sound anywhere." A pause. "I thought I'd forgotten it." Ethan let the engine run for another 10 minutes before he turned it off. The silence it left was the kind that had texture, the kind where you could still feel what had just been in it. Victoria stood in the garage for a long time after, just looking at the car. Ethan gave her that. He busied himself with cleanup, wiping tools, organizing his notes, the end-of-job work that had a rhythm he could do without thinking. Thomas had disappeared back toward the house, giving them both space in the way he gave things without being asked. "I want to drive it," Victoria said. Ethan looked up. "Today?" "When you think it's ready." She looked at him. "Is it ready?" He thought about it honestly. "It should sit running for a few more hours over the next day or two. Let everything settle back in, but yes, by Saturday, it's ready." She nodded. She put her hand on the roof of the car again, flat-palmed, and this time the gesture was different from all the previous times. Not grief, not the careful not touching of something that hurt, something closer to recognition, like finally being able to hold what you'd been carrying at arm's length. "Saturday," she said. Marcus arrived Friday evening. Ethan picked him up at the gate himself this time, and they drove up the long driveway together in Ethan's truck with the windows down because the air conditioning was still broken and probably always would be. Marcus looked out the window at the approaching house and said, "It's bigger than I remembered. It's the same size. I was impressed by the car last time. This time, I'm actually looking at the house." Thomas had made up a proper guest room in the main house, which Victoria had arranged without Ethan asking, and which Marcus accepted with the particular teenage mix of trying not to seem impressed and very clearly being impressed. Dinner that evening was the four of them, Ethan, Marcus, Victoria, Thomas, around the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, which had been Victoria's choice and which had the effect of making the meal feel like something other than an occasion, which made it easier for everyone. Marcus asked Victoria about the architectural history degree she'd never used. Ethan didn't know how Marcus knew about it. He must have mentioned it, though he didn't remember doing so, and the question caught Victoria slightly off guard, which almost never happened. "How did you know about that?" she said. Marcus looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at his coffee. "My dad talks about this place a lot," Marcus said, which was apparently true without Ethan having fully registered it. Not like in detail, just in passing. A lot. Victoria looked at Ethan with an expression that was composed, but carried a note of something that might have been satisfaction. He did not meet her eyes. "I never practiced," Victoria said, turning back to Marcus. "I got the degree and then went directly into the family business, and the architecture stayed theoretical." "Do you regret it?" The question was so direct that Thomas paused in pouring water. Marcus had a gift for the question that cut straight to the thing, had always had it, even as a small boy. And Ethan had sometimes found it uncomfortable and was finding it more useful now. "Yes," Victoria said after a moment, "but regret is only useful if you do something with it. I've been thinking about doing something with it." "Like what?" "There are historically significant buildings in this county that nobody has properly documented. The estate itself has structures that haven't been studied architecturally." She paused. "I've been thinking about starting there." "You should," Marcus said with the uncomplicated confidence of a 15-year-old who hadn't yet learned to hedge his convictions. "What's stopping you?" Victoria looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed. A real laugh, not the careful social version, something that came from somewhere genuine and surprised her slightly. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing, actually." Ethan looked at his son across the table and felt something that was complicated and simple at the same time. The way the best feelings were. Saturday morning came in cool and clear, the kind of Georgia morning that happened briefly in early fall before the heat remembered itself. Ethan had been in the garage since 7, running the engine for a final hour, checking everything one last time, doing the things you did when you'd finished a piece of work and needed to be certain before you handed it over. At 9, Victoria appeared in the garage in a blue dress he hadn't seen before. Not formal, but deliberate. She'd made a choice about what to wear for this, which told him what it meant to her. Marcus was behind her, in the closest thing to good shoes he'd been able to manage, which were clean sneakers. Ethan decided they counted. Thomas stood near the garage wall, arms folded, in the position of a man who intended to witness something. Ethan held out the key. Victoria looked at it. She took it from him. Her hand was steady. She walked around to the driver's side and opened the door and got in. And for a moment she just sat there with her hands in her lap, not yet putting the key in the ignition. Ethan stood outside the passenger window and watched her and didn't say anything. Marcus stood beside him, quiet in the specific way of someone who understood, without being told, that this was a moment that required quiet. He could see Victoria's face through the window. She was looking at the steering wheel, or not at it, past it, through it, at something in the distance that was also something in the past. Her father's hands had been on this wheel. Every Sunday morning for 22 years, on every road between here and wherever he'd driven, those hands had held this. She put the key in. She turned it. The Rolls-Royce silver shadow came back to life for the second time in 2 days, and this time there were witnesses. The engine ran as it had the morning before, deep and even and composed, the sound of something built by people who believed that excellence didn't need to be loud. Victoria sat with both hands on the wheel and breathed, and Ethan watched her breathe, and beside him Marcus said very quietly, "Wow." and that was exactly the right word. She drove it around the property's perimeter road, a long loop through the property's grounds, through the hardwood corridors and past the south garden and back around by the pond. Ethan and Marcus watched her go and then walked to the end of the drive to wait for her to come back. The sound of the engine faded and then returned as she completed the loop, and when she pulled back up to the garage and stopped and got out, she stood beside the running car for a moment with her hand on the roof. Her eyes were bright. She didn't comment on that, and nobody else did either. "It's perfect," she said. It drives like I remember it sounding from my window." "It should," Ethan said. "Everything that made it what it was is still there. We just had to clear what was in the way." She looked at him, and he had the feeling, which had been building for days and was now simply present, that she understood he wasn't only talking about the car. "Thank you," she said. Not the formal thank you of the employer at the end of a job. The other kind. "It was good work," he said, "the kind worth doing." Marcus, standing slightly to the side, watched the two of them with the expression of a 15-year-old who was smarter than he usually let on, and had drawn several conclusions he was keeping to himself. The drive to Augusta took Ethan 3 hours and 20 minutes on a Sunday, which was the day after Marcus went home with Dana, who had come to the estate to collect him, and had stood in the driveway looking at the house and the grounds with the expression of someone filing information they weren't sure what to do with. She and Ethan had spoken for a few minutes, ordinary practical things, Marcus's schedule, a dentist appointment the following week, and then she'd looked at him with the evaluating look she'd always had, the one that had once unsettled him and now just felt honest. "You seem different," she said. "Finishing a good job does that." She looked at him for another moment. "Just the job?" she said. "Dana, I'm not starting anything. I'm just observing." She looked toward the house. "She seems like a serious person." "She is." "Good," Dana said, and got in the car, and Ethan watched his son wave from the passenger window as they went down the drive and felt the particular bittersweet of a good visit ending, which was better than the particular bittersweet of a bad one. The veterans' facility outside Augusta was called Sycamore Ridge, which was the kind of name that tried hard and couldn't quite overcome what the place was. Clean and well-maintained and full of people in the last chapter of their lives. Frank Walker had a room on the second floor with a window that looked out over a courtyard with actual sycamore trees, which Ethan had always thought was either very thoughtful or very accidental. His father was in the common room when Ethan arrived, watching a baseball game with two other men who didn't appear to be watching as much as using the television as a reason to sit together. Frank Walker at 73 was smaller than Ethan remembered him being for most of his life. The way old men sometimes became physically smaller, as though the body was quietly editing itself. His hair was fully white. His hands, Ethan noticed, still looked like his hands, a working man's hands, the kind you didn't lose even when you stopped working. Frank looked up and saw his son in the doorway, and something moved across his face that was not the cautious bracing for something expression Ethan usually got on the phone. "You came," he said. "I said I would." They went to his father's room, which was quiet and smelled of the specific institutional cleanliness of places that tried not to smell institutional. Frank sat in the chair by the window, and Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, and they were quiet for a moment the way they were usually quiet, and then Ethan said, "Tell me." Frank told him. It came out in the halting, non-linear way of things that have been held quietly for a very long time. Not a polished story, not a confession with clear, dramatic beats, but the real thing, which was ragged at the edges and had gaps where memory had softened the details, and moments where Frank's voice got thin and had to be rebuilt. In 1987, Frank Walker had been working for an estate supply company, a company that sourced rare parts and materials for wealthy collectors and restoration projects. He had access, through his work, to a network of suppliers and a small amount of financial trust that came with that access. He had used that trust wrongly, not grotesquely, not criminally in the way that put men in prison, but wrongly. He had falsified some invoices over several months to cover debts that had accumulated from the drinking and from poor decisions and from the particular snowball physics of a life running slightly faster downhill than he could keep up with. The company had eventually noticed. The man who owned the company at that time had a business relationship with William Ashford, and William Ashford had been one of the clients whose account had been, tangentially, in a small way, but genuinely, affected by what Frank had done. "Why did he help you?" Ethan asked. "When he found out." Frank was quiet for a moment. He said, he stopped, cleared his throat. He said he knew what it was to make choices out of desperation and have them become the wrong choices. He said he wasn't in the business of ruining men who were already ruining themselves. His hands turned over in his lap. He paid back what I'd taken from his account, quietly, so the company wouldn't pursue it further. And he told me that was the end of his involvement and I should sort out the rest. And you did. Took me 3 more years and it got worse before it got better. But yes, eventually. He looked out the window. I never told him thank you properly. I wrote a letter once and didn't send it. I thought, a man like that doesn't want letters from men like me. Ethan thought about William Ashford's precise handwriting, about a sealed envelope with his name on it, about a man who put things down rather than handed them to people, and who had apparently understood something about Frank Walker that Frank hadn't understood about himself, that the debt between them was not only financial. He watched out for me, Ethan said, over the years at a distance. He's the reason I got called to restore the car. But Frank looked at him. I know, he said. You knew? Gerald Fitch called me. About 2 years before he retired, said William Ashford had given him my son's name and asked him to keep it. Gerald wanted to know if I had any objection. Frank paused. I said no. Ethan sat with that. The room was quiet. In the courtyard below, a sycamore tree was doing something slow and golden with the fall light. You could have told me, Ethan said. His voice was steady. He'd decided on the drive that he was going to say the things he needed to say without performing them. About all of it. About what happened, about the connection to the Ashfords, about any of it. I was an adult for most of the time you were carrying this. I know. Then why? Frank Walker looked at his hands, the working man's hands. Because I was ashamed, he said, and because telling you meant explaining who I was at 35 and who I was at 35 was someone I didn't know how to explain to someone who was supposed to look up to me. He paused. That's not a good reason. I know it's not a good reason. I'm not saying it to excuse it. I know, Ethan said. You deserved better, his father said. From the beginning. You deserved a father who showed up properly, and I didn't know how to be that, and by the time I figured out some of it, you'd already learned to live without expecting it. He was looking at his hands. That's the thing that's hardest to live with. Not the mistakes I made when you were small. The fact that you stopped expecting anything from me, and I let you stop, because it was easier than trying to change it. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sycamore moved in whatever breeze reached the courtyard. A cardinal landed on the bird feeder someone had hung from the lower branch, and sat there looking alert and then flew off. I've been doing the same thing with Marcus, Ethan said. His father looked up. Not the same things, different ones, but the same pattern, the gap, and letting him get used to the gap, because changing it was harder than maintaining it. He looked at his father's face, which was old now, which was the face of a man in the last section of his life, which was a fact that would once have been a relief to Ethan and was now something more complicated. I'm not going to do that anymore. Good, his father said, simply, without elaborating. I need you to know, Ethan said, that I'm not here to make you feel worse about the past. I needed to know the truth, and I needed to say what I said. But I'm not interested in spending whatever time we have left on accounting. He paused. I'm interested in something different. Frank Walker looked at his son for a long moment with the eyes of a man who had been waiting for a long time for something he'd been afraid to name, because naming it felt like wanting something he didn't deserve. All right, he said. His voice was not steady. He didn't try to make it steady. All right, Ethan. They talked for 3 hours. It was not a redemption. It was messier than that, more halting, with long pauses and a few places where one of them said something and the other needed time before responding. They talked about Frank's years before Ethan was born, The story of a man who'd started with real intentions and made real errors and had never found the clean moment to reverse direction. They talked about Ethan's mother, who had died when Ethan was 19 and whom they'd never properly grieved together. They talked about Marcus, and Frank asked question after question about his grandson, with the hunger of someone who understood he'd missed time he couldn't recover and was trying to understand the shape of who the boy had become. When Ethan left in the late afternoon, his father walked him to the elevator and stood in the hallway, looking smaller than the idea of him that Ethan had been carrying. "Come back," Frank said. "I will," Ethan said. He meant it in the way you meant things when you'd stopped just saying them. In the elevator going down, Ethan leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling and thought about two men who hadn't known how to hand things to people, and their children who had inherited that in different measures and the work of unlearning it. He called Marcus that night from a gas station parking lot outside Augusta because he didn't want to wait until he got home. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" he asked, which meant he'd known what the visit was for, which meant Ethan had told him more than he'd realized. "Hard," Ethan said. "Good. Both." He was leaning against his truck in the parking lot with the last of the day's light going orange over the pines. "Your grandfather wants to meet you properly, not the visit on Christmas version, actually properly." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, I'd like that. I should have made that happen years ago." "Dad, I'm not beating myself up. I'm just saying it so you know I know it." "Okay," Marcus said again. Then after a pause, "How's the car?" Ethan smiled at the pines. "Running," he said. "It runs like you wouldn't believe. I want to hear it sometime." "You did hear it. You were standing right there." "I know. I want to hear it again." A pause. "Is that weird?" "No," Ethan said. "That's not weird at all." He went back to the estate one more time 10 days later. He told himself it was to do a follow-up inspection, a final check, a professional responsibility, the kind of thing he did with any significant restoration job. That was true, as far as it went. It didn't go the whole way. Victoria met him at the gate, which she hadn't done any of the previous times. She was in the garden clothes, the real clothes, and she'd driven the Rolls-Royce around to the front of the house, which sat in the morning light looking like it had always been exactly where it was, and had always been exactly what it now was. He checked the engine, he checked the fluid levels, the timing, the fuel system. Everything was as it should be. He'd expected it to be. He took his time anyway. When he was done, he closed the hood and stood back and looked at the car. "It's going to need regular maintenance from here on," he said. "Older engines need attention if they're going to keep running. You can't just start it and ignore it." "I know," Victoria said. She was leaning against the passenger door. "Thomas has been doing his research. There's a specialist in Atlanta, Rolls-Royce Vintage. I'll give you his number, but call me first if anything sounds wrong. I'll tell you if it's actually worth the drive." She looked at him. "So you're available?" "Professionally?" he said. "Is that the only way?" He looked at her. She looked back at him with the eyes that had been closed when he arrived and were open now, fully, steadily, without the armor or the compression or the careful management of what she let through. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what your father wrote in the letter, the last part." She straightened slightly. She didn't speak. "He said you'd need someone who was willing to say the important things while you learned how." He paused. "I think he was wrong about that. I don't think you need someone to say things for you. I think you needed to stop waiting for permission to say them yourself." He paused. "I think you've mostly figured that out." "Mostly," she said. "But I also think he was right that you shouldn't have to figure everything out alone." He turned his hat in his hands once, the nervous gesture he almost never made and didn't fully catch himself making. "I live in Savannah. That's 3 hours from here." "I know where Savannah is, Ethan. I'm saying it's not nothing. It's a real distance." "Most things worth the distance are actually a distance," she said. "That's how you know they're worth it." He looked at her for a moment. The morning light was doing the sideways thing through the pecans. The mockingbird was in the magnolias. It was always in the magnolias. "I'd like to come back," he said. "Not to fix anything. Just to come back." Victoria Ashford stood beside her father's car in the morning light and looked at the man who had found what 14 experts had missed, who had handed her things that needed handing instead of putting them down and walking away, who had sat in her father's driver's seat and brought the engine back from silence, and she said, "I'd like that too." It was not a grand declaration. It was not a Hollywood ending. Neither of them moved toward the other with any kind of dramatic intent, because they were both people who'd learned to be careful about dramatic intents, who'd both paid costs for moving too fast and then for not moving at all, who were both, at this particular moment, tired of performing and interested in being honest. They stood in the driveway beside the running car and talked for another hour. About her architectural history project, which was becoming real, which she'd started outlining in a notebook she'd found in her father's desk. About Marcus and the presentation, and the 89 he'd gotten on the makeup version. About Frank Walker in the chair by the window at Sycamore Ridge. About Thomas, who had apparently already started corresponding with the Atlanta specialist and had printed out 3 articles about vintage Rolls-Royce maintenance from the internet, which Ethan found deeply touching. When he finally said he had to get on the road, she walked him to his truck. They stood beside it for a moment in the specific way of people who don't yet have a language for parting but are working on building one. "Drive safe," she said. "I'll call when I'm back," he said. "You don't have to report in." "I know, I want to." She looked at him, and the almost smile was finally, fully the real thing. Not brief this time, not crooked with self-consciousness, just the face she had when she wasn't managing it. "Okay," she said, "call when you're back." He got in the truck. The engine turned over. His truck's engine, the ordinary battered engine of a working man's ordinary battered vehicle. And he pulled around the drive and down through the magnolias and through the gate onto the county road. And in his rearview mirror, he could see the gate close slowly behind him. He drove with the windows down all the way to the highway. And then on the highway, even when the wind made it impractical, because the air was doing something good in the fall, and he wasn't ready to close it out. He thought about William Ashford, who had disabled a car rather than speak, and hidden a letter rather than call, and had managed, from beyond everything, to arrange one final act of repair. A man who had finally found a language at the end, too late for himself, but not too late for the people he'd left behind. He thought about his father, sitting by the window with the sycamore trees, saying, "All right," Ethan in a voice that hadn't been steady and hadn't tried to be. He thought about Marcus, who had stood in a stranger's garage and looked up at an undercarriage and said, "This is kind of brilliant and kind of messed up," and who had been exactly right. He thought about a 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow that had sat in silence for 7 years and had come back to itself, fully and without apology, the moment someone removed what was blocking it. Here was the thing about engines, the thing Ethan had known for 22 years of working on them. They did not break easily. Most of the time, when an engine failed, it was not because the engine was ruined. It was because something small had gotten in the way of something necessary. A seal dried out, a circuit interrupted, a line blocked, and the engine, which was fundamentally sound, fundamentally built to run, had simply stopped because it had no other option. The repair was rarely the dramatic thing. The repair was almost always the patient removal of what was in the way. He'd been a mechanic for 22 years. And he was only now understanding that this was true of more than engines. The highway opened up through the pine forests of central Georgia, and the October light came through the trees in long bars, and Ethan Walker drove towards Savannah with the windows down and something that was neither happiness nor its opposite, but was larger than both. The particular feeling of a man who has done necessary work and is heading toward more of it, who has said the things that needed saying and heard the things that needed hearing, who knows that what comes next will not be simple and does not need it to be. 3 hours to Savannah, a garage to open Monday morning, a son to have dinner with Tuesday, a father to visit on the weekend, a woman 3 hours away who grew tomatoes in the real garden and laughed when she meant it and was learning, the same as he was, that the important things could still be said if you stopped waiting for the perfect moment and just said them. The windows stayed down all the way home.